Professor, sorry. I'm pleased to introduce Professor Ashton Verdery. Professor Verdery is an associate professor of sociology and demography at Penn State. His research focuses on social networks and on demographic processes, specifically how population dynamics shape family, kinship, and social networks, and how those networks in turn affect health and other population processes. His work includes topics such as the network ties that migrants retain and make, and using social networks as a basis for sampling populations that are otherwise difficult to survey, including migrants, those at risk of sexually transmitted or bloodborne infections, and opioid users. So we'll have about 45 minutes for your talk and questions, and then we'll try to do a short break after that. So please welcome me in joining Professor Verdery.
Thank you for having me. It's super honored to be here. I wanted to mention my children started back at daycare, which has been wonderful, but I got a pretty severe cold the last couple of days. So if I start coughing, I apologize, and I'll try and not do that. I've got some tea. Let me share my screen. You can see the screen.
Yes.
Looks great.
Looks good.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk about some of the recent work I've been doing related to COVID-19 and some demographic kind of modeling approaches to understand the ways COVID-19 has kind of affected people who are left behind by the deaths, the bereaved individuals. I wanted to highlight my co-authors on this project, including Emily Smith-Greenaway, my postdoctoral scholar who's just fantastic, Hao-Wei Wang, Rachel Margolis, and Jonathan Dawes, some of my collaborators on this and several related projects. As you know, COVID has been a very severe disruption. There's millions of cases around the world. In the US, about 600,000 people have died, according to registered models, slightly higher than that if you look at excess death counts. And we all know that this has represented a very radical shifts in people's lives. Millions are unemployed, huge levels of individuals kind of teleworking, still a very large number of children in remote schooling and things like that. And we know that this has been a very strong mortality shock. And I think most of the emphasis on COVID-19's disruption has focused on this mortality shock. This is for the United States, and this is a count of the deaths according to COVID, and then in the 5 prior years. And you can see that beginning in kind of March, there was a first wave of COVID crisis in the United States. And then starting late fall, there was a much larger wave where the numbers of COVID deaths vastly exceeded the numbers of deaths in the years prior, which suggests that it's really acute mortality shock. And the United States is not the only country that has experienced this. If we look at kind of severity rates in last summer and then current severity rates, we can see that the COVID crisis struck some countries first, but has really diffused through many regions of the world and is hitting many parts of the world extremely hard in the last couple months. I'm going to kind of turn back to this kind of idea of looking beyond the United States later in the presentation, but I wanted to highlight it here just to give a sense of the kind of global variation in the severity of the COVID-19 mortality crisis. So we know a lot about who dies from COVID-19. There's been substantial research on the age profile of death, on men's greater likelihood of dying, on race disparities in it, how comorbidities and kind of regional kind of differences influence the death rates. And of course, there's a lot more to learn on this. But one of the things that I thought, particularly last spring, had not received very much attention was who is left behind by those who are dying from COVID-19. At that time, last April or thereabouts, there was a broad kind of cultural narrative in the United States media that most of the people who were dying of COVID-19 were older adults. There was a sort of undercurrent to that, which I saw on Facebook posts and tweets and things like that, that almost no one knows anybody who's died of this, kind of what I would view as a somewhat ageist kind of perspective, that everyone who is dying of this is older and in a nursing home, and they don't have many family members who care about them and that sort of stuff. And, I thought that those things struck me as A, unlikely, and B, challenging to kind of begin to study. And so I was interested in starting to understand who was left behind by those who died from COVID-19 and getting a sense of how many people there might be that are influenced by this, who those people might be, and how deeply they might be affected in the short and potentially the long term. So there are lots of great questions that could be built on this, but I'm not going to address all of them. One of the questions that I can't really address here is how COVID-19 compares to other types of bereavement, but there's fantastic work by Melissa Snyder, Diego Alvarez Gutierrez, and others focused on comparing COVID-19 bereavement rates to bereavement rates that were occurring under a counterfactual scenario. And there's also some interesting work and questions about how lasting the COVID-19 bereavement effect might be. But I can't address those. I'm just going to deal with the first three questions. If we look at the COVID-19 mortality profile, we do see that there is this tendency that almost all of the deaths are among older adults. In China, Spain, South Korea, Italy, the United States, and almost everywhere you look, the vast majority of deaths are among those age 50 plus, and there's a really steep age gradient associated with it. This is another part of the pandemic's challenge in the United States, is that there are pretty large race disparities. If you look at the raw population numbers, they're not that large. For instance, 59% of COVID deaths are among non-Hispanic white individuals. 60% of the population is non-Hispanic white individuals. But like, one of those textbook examples of demographic confounding kind of problems, when you actually start adjusting for age, you see huge differences by race in the rates of COVID-19. And that graph on the bottom there, on the bottom left on my screen, shows the kind of age-specific deviation in COVID-19 mortality rates from population levels. And you can see Hispanics, non-Hispanic Blacks, and to a lesser extent, other kind of race groups are substantially elevated in terms of their death experience at each age, whereas non-Hispanic whites are substantially lower than what would be expected based on their population share at each age. But when you actually aggregate it to the population level in a kind of textbook way, it comes out to approximately equivalent rates. So I think that's one of the kind of fascinating, I imagine this will be a textbook example in the future years. So I was interested in understanding how COVID-19 bereavement might ripple through the United States. And talking to my colleague, Jim Moody at Duke University, we spoke a little bit about sort of using relatively simple network scale-up approaches to understand this. And Jim was already pretty far out ahead of me in doing this, building on prior work that he had done and people in the 1990s had done to estimate sort of the population percentage that might have experienced a death based on kind of assumed social network size. And so here, this map here shows Jim's calculations of if we assume that everyone in each county has 20 within county friends, how many, what proportion of the population would have experienced bereavement from COVID-19 based on those county level death rates. And you can see some surprising levels of clustering in the Midwest, but very elevated clustering in the Northeast, the Boston region, New Jersey, New York City, and things like that. There are other ways to do this I do want to highlight that could be very useful. Dennis Feehan, who's a organizer of this, has fantastic tools for understanding network scale-up approaches, and I think there could be really great applications of that in the future. But one challenge with this approach is that it assumes that everyone has sort of the same, that the approach that Moody graphed here, it assumes that everyone has the same number of friends. It assumes certain kind of simplifications that may not accurately reflect kind of the bereavement experience. Counties differ in their age rate, and we know that COVID-19 is highly age graded, for instance. To kind of set up, before I get into my specific kind of contributions, there are a number of reasons that we should care about this. For instance, people who experience a family member's death go on to develop substantially elevated risks of mortality in the first 3 months and about 15% mortality elevation for several months thereafter. A very substantial portion of them go on to develop prolonged grief disorder and other severe psychiatric complications. And there's a lot of speculation that the attributes of COVID-19 deaths would be expected to make these experiences even more likely because they have kind of what are considered the hallmarks of bad deaths. There are also substantial other disruptions that are worth exploring stemming from bereavement, including people's mental health kind of disruptions, changes in their educational trajectories, their criminal justice system involvement, whether they get divorced or lose their jobs and things like that. But in general, this hasn't been as clearly connected to COVID-19. So that's going to be one of the research questions that I try and answer in this talk. So first, I'm going to discuss 2 manuscripts where we tried to understand how many people are affected by COVID-19 related bereavement and who those people might be. and some of the results are rather surprising. First, we used a demographic modeling approach, and our goal was to use what we considered a bereavement multiplier to track the potential scope of grief and quantify the family bereavement experiences. One challenge with COVID-19, particularly last April when we were writing this manuscript, is that there is no real-time data on the kind of population experience of bereavement. There were some Pew surveys that asked questions in a way that I think might lead to substantial biases, but there was not clear evidence of kind of population trackers for who had experienced COVID-19 bereavement. Second, when we were writing the manuscript, one of the challenges is that it was very clear that the pandemic was going to evolve severely in the United States and lead to substantially larger levels of death than had occurred by March and April of last year. But all these kind of, as I mentioned, tweets and Facebook posts where people were saying, oh, we don't know anyone who's died of COVID-19. That kind of perspective was taking this localized time perspective, and we wanted to have a sense of what the entire pandemic would be. And then the third problem is we wanted to better account for race variation within it. So we tried to come up with some kind of projection methods, but they always led us into this place that we would end up estimating the number of people who would be bereaved, and that would be dependent on an estimate of the number of cases that would happen in the United States, rather than a sense of something that would allow us to track the progression of bereavement throughout the pandemic. And so through a series of analyses, we actually found that there was a relatively consistent multiplier, no matter how many deaths resulted from the pandemic, owing to the kind of age gradient in infection and mortality profiles. And this multiplier resulted, in a way that we could take the estimates from April and apply them to, say, November or December and still have a reasonable approximation of bereavement experiences. So I'll talk through that a little bit. Because this is the Berkeley Formal Demography seminar, I wanted to highlight the vital role that the SocSim demographic microsimulation played in our kind of estimates. We built our models through a microsimulation model that we've been working on several years for the United States to understand kind of the changing nature of US kinship networks. And because we already had that going, we were able to move relatively quickly to try and understand what the bereavement experiences might be. So we tried to come up with these representative estimates of US kinship networks in a series of prior studies, including survey-based estimates and demographic microsimulation estimates. I don't want to get into too many of the details, but the basic idea is that it's a computational model of US family relationships where we try and plug in underlying demographic rates and at a race, age, sex, and marital status specific level, and see how the changing nature of US family relationships occur. And in some prior work and in this manuscript, we tried to compare our simulation-based results to what you could get from survey-based estimates with various adjustments. So the graph there on the bottom shows our estimated kind of means for age-specific variation in ties to certain types of relatives, comparing the simulation results to the panel study of income dynamics and some statistically adjusted models. And once we had kind of come up with underlying demographic, the demographic microsimulation and underlying kind of kinship networks for the United States, we were able to use that to simulate upon the kinship network infection rates, and then simulate deaths on the infection rates using kind of estimates of infection fatality ratios. And we did a lot of sensitivity checks, but in almost all of the approaches that we used, we ended up finding relatively constant rates of a bereavement multiplier. So the main results were that about 9 individuals lose a close family member for each COVID-19 death in the United States. We focused on grandparent ties, parent ties, sibling ties, spouse ties, and child ties. And as much as this kind of 9 aggregation occurs, there is some variation across the life cycle, and there's variation across the life cycle in the types of kin ties that we would expect to lose. To some extent, this is not hugely surprising, but there are actually some surprising results that emanate from it. For instance, younger adults are much more likely to lose grandparents than older adults, because older adults have fewer living grandparents, whereas older adults are much more likely to lose spouses than younger adults, because many younger adults are not married, or the people they're married to are not at risk of dying of COVID-19 at high levels. But still, some of the results are relatively surprising. For instance, in many age groups, each COVID-19 death is expected to leave about one individual bereaved. Second, the level differences can be quite informative for understanding the kind of scope of COVID-19 mortality crisis and what it might lead to for bereavement. In particular, I wanted to highlight this level down here, where even though these numbers look young, and each COVID-19 death is leaving about 0.1 individual ages 10 to 19 years old bereaved, this can still translate into substantial levels of ultimate bereavement rates in that population. So in a second follow-up paper, we tried to focus in on that bottom estimate. We used the bereavement multiplier from individuals 0 to 17 years old and multiplied that by the current kind of death rates. And this led to a relatively surprising finding that about 37,000 to 43,000 children in the US, children under the ages of 18, had lost a parent. And this was a substantial increase over typical year levels, whereas typical years, about 200,000 individuals under the ages of 18 lose a parent, according to our models and other estimates. Our models were suggesting that this was approximately a 20% increase over that rate. One surprising thing is that this was actually higher than the rate of increase in loss of parents among all age groups, which is something that we're going to explore a little bit in the future. One thing that kind of made me feel a little bit better about our estimates was that very recently, as of a couple days ago, I found that the Social Security Administration had released estimates of the 2020 survivor benefit numbers. And their estimates of the increased number of children under the age of 18 who are claiming parental survivorship benefits was about 20,000, which is very much in line with our kind of model-based estimates that we have for the numbers of kids that have survived COVID-19 and lost a parent. This has huge implications, I think, for understanding kind of the bereavement burden in the United States. Our current estimates suggest that about 5.3 million people are bereaved. If we use kind of estimates from IHME, which suggests a much higher rate of total death counts in the United States, they suggest about 8.3 million total deaths attributable to COVID-19. Sorry, they suggest substantially higher numbers of deaths attributable to COVID-19, which would imply 8.3 million individuals bereaved. But the good news is that we're largely through the worst of this. And there's going to be only a few 100,000 more increase in the number of people bereaved from COVID-19, according to kind of the projection models that are updated as of quite recently. But this last winter was a dark time. I gave a presentation on this in January and another in March. And I didn't update this slide for today, but I do want to highlight how staggeringly awful our results were in terms of these implications. On January 7th, I looked up the number of deaths of 4,081 deaths on that date. March 17th, 1,200 deaths. And each day I would kind of look up deaths and I would plug in our estimates, and just the shock of the numbers of people that were expected to have lost a parent that day or potentially lost a child that day really just depressed me. And it was a very challenging kind of thing to grapple with as a researcher, to think like these implications are really just staggering and quite stunning. We did attempt to check our results against a number of other alternate modeling strategies. Many of these didn't actually make it into the manuscripts owing to kind of page constraints. But for instance, with the JAMA Pediatrics article, we tested our results against what you'd obtain from ACS estimates of the mean numbers of children and then the numbers of COVID deaths among that age range, and of parents among that age range. And the results are quite comparable. Likewise, we tested our approach against the demographic microsimulation approach and found also comparable results. So I'll turn very briefly to this idea of how deeply people might be affected by COVID-19. Our goal here was to move beyond the United States and to understand bereavement prevalence in other countries. And we wanted to use survey data rather than demographic modeling because some survey data were available that were quite unique. We also wanted to understand COVID-19 contributions to depression. Unfortunately, the data only asked a single item, do you feel sad or depressed? And if so, is it worse than before COVID-19? But we did model both of these and found relatively consistent results. So we made use of data from the SHARE project, which is a wonderful survey of older adults in Europe. And it's a long-running survey since 2004 to the present. Surveys people in 28 countries using really consistent measurement, and it's nationally representative. One thing that was quite unique about the data is that SHARE was actively in the field. They had the sampling frame already developed, the people that they intended to contact, both for longitudinal follow-up interviews as well as refresher interviews. But as of March 2020, they had to shut down their kind of survey estimates. And they resumed their survey estimates in June with still about half the sample intended to collect. And so they went on and they fielded a specific COVID-19 questionnaire. There are some challenges where they switched to telephone modes and things like that. But we're going to analyze that 52,000 people that were contacted between June and August of 2020 during the kind of first wave of the European crisis. The bereavement prevalence estimates that we get from that vary substantially between the countries, and they're very consistent with the first wave kind of rates in those countries. For instance, Belgium has by far the highest reported bereavement in the SHARE surveys, had the highest kind of deaths per million according to that time. These correlate very strongly, the kind of overall death rates with the bereavement prevalence, no matter which way you look at it. And there's not very much of a correlation with bereavement prevalence and kind of baseline mortality rates pre-pandemic, which I think is suggestive that we can probably extrapolate the kind of idea that, with some caveats, the idea that a more severe mortality crisis in different countries, for instance, India is going through a very severe crisis right now, they will have very substantial rates of bereavement. There's a lot of interesting work to be done on this. One thing that I wanted to highlight, it's not particularly informative and it didn't make it into our manuscript, but I'm still kind of exploring it as an idea, is to try and extrapolate that first wave bereavement prevalence from the June to August 2020 period to the present period. I've tried different approaches. Unfortunately, they give slightly different results, but there are some relatively consistent kind of estimates from it. So what I did first was I applied a fractional logit model of bereavement levels in each of these countries as predicted by the August 2020 death rates. And then I substituted the current death rates from these countries and what does the bereavement prevalence imply? That's the graph on the left here. The graph on the right, I used those estimates from the network scale up approach and solved for the kind of implied network size in these countries. For many of them, the implied network size is between 150 and 250 people. But in some of the small countries and the countries with very low death rates, the numbers are pretty unstable. But no matter which of these approaches you use, it does highlight very severe second wave bereavement kind of implications for a number of countries in Eastern Europe, in particular the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and well, the Czech Republic. We also built on this by trying to understand levels of depression in these countries. So we looked at both whether individuals feel depressed or whether they feel more depressed. The graphs on the left panels, A and C, are individual depression. The graphs on the right panels are kind of feeling more depressed. The top two panels is individual experience with bereavement, separated by gender. The bottom two panels are national mortality rates and depression. And we did find some interesting gender distinctions that I won't dwell on too much, but I do want to highlight that the individual bereavement experiences are very robustly associated with higher odds of depression. The odds ratios are like 1.5 for kind of depression, slightly worse if it's a family member who you report losing than a non-family member. And they're slightly higher for women than men. And these models control for a number of other kind of things. So summary of the kind of results from that manuscript is that rather than kind of looking at the influences of lockdowns or social distancing and things like that, we were looking at specific linkages between the bereavement crisis and the mortality crisis and individuals' mental health among older adults. It's one of the first cross-national estimates of the association between COVID-19 bereavement and mental health. And it really, I think it's probably the first that uses nationally representative data. We also found very strong national variation in bereavement prevalence with substantial inequalities between countries that could be the basis for future scholarship. So to wrap up, COVID-19 has created this bereavement crisis that is going to reverberate, I believe, for quite a long time in these countries. It has a substantial emotional toll on individuals, And it also has severe implications for kind of social support networks and things like that. I think that these challenges are only going to be exacerbated by the challenges associated with COVID-19 deaths, and that and the lack of funerals and things like that, and that this may form the basis of a kind of future research agenda focused on understanding this particular mortality crisis. I think that we need a lot of national kind of efforts to understand these implications and to better address their downstream effects. For instance, estimates from David Weaver suggest that only about 50% of children who lose a parent to mortality are connected to Social Security and other social services. And so that's a clear effort for the kind of federal government to prioritize connecting children to their kind of benefits to which they are eligible, because his research shows quite clearly that children who are connected to those benefits fare substantially better. And then last, I wanted to highlight that I think that there's a lot in this kind of stream of research which highlights the value of demographic modeling approaches. I guess I would call kind of the demographic microsimulation, I don't know if it would qualify as formal demography, but I guess it's at the very least business casual demography. And I think it highlights the real utility that can be used with this. And then I think that there are a lot of great opportunities to apply other approaches, including Dennis Feehan's fantastic scale-up work, his estimates of kind of sibling mortality. Basically, he's done so much fantastic work on developing methods that could be leveraged to better understand this crisis and the long-term toll that it might have. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. So if anyone has questions, you can raise your hand and I can call on you. Otherwise, I can start with what's in the chat for now. Okay, so there is a comment about Professor Beth Redbird, who's collected nationally representative survey data with items on losing a household or family member to COVID. Sounds like the first wave was in late March and she's just finished collecting the latest wave. If you have any thoughts on it would be interesting to compare the results from her survey with the results from your modeling and simulation.
Yeah, that's great. I wasn't aware of that. I will check that out. I do have a few kind of general comments on sort of the survey-based challenges with collecting this. I don't know anything about the provenance of this, but I am always skeptical of kind of the internet panel approach to nationally representative data. So I would need to look more into whether this survey is a population-based kind of survey, but I think that there could be very good uses of that. And I think that's very exciting work.
Great. Okay. Do we see differences in the bereavement rate per population size by race or ethnicity? And if so, how large are the differences across groups? Do we see more parents lost, for example, among Blacks or Hispanics?
Yes, I have a few answers to this. One is that the ultimate multipliers that we found do differ very slightly, but not as much as you would think. The real difference is in what it is being multiplied by. The kind of population prevalence of mortality for Black and Hispanic populations is substantially larger than for non-Hispanic white populations, which leads to kind of greater penetration of bereavement in those populations. In terms of the parental death rates, this is one of those kind of statistics that the numbers don't make it sound very big. Our estimates suggest that about 20% of children under the age of Black children that 20% of the children who lost a parent to COVID-19 were Black children under the age of 18, but Black children under the age of 18 make up about 14% of the population. So 14 versus 20%, it doesn't sound that big, but that is kind of a incident rate ratio that, 1.5 or so. So if you kind of think of it in those terms, it is a pretty substantial deviation. And again, that is largely because of differences in what it is being multiplied by, rather than the kind of multipliers that we used.
Great. Another question, infection spreads to some extent within families, and SocSim would allow you to estimate multiple bereavement with correlated infection, like loss of grandmother-grandfather pairs. Might you try to look at that?
That's something that we were interested in looking at. It came up a number of times. I tried a few different things, and basically I kept finding results that were quite limited in that regard. One challenge with that is various meta-analyses suggest that the household secondary attack rate for COVID-19 is about 16%. And when you start multiplying relatively small infection ratios by 16%, relatively small infection fatality ratios by 16%, you start getting relatively low levels of clustering. We do see some in our data, but it wasn't the primary story of what we saw. Likewise, there were estimates that were produced roughly came out just about the same time, and it's a preprint that came out just after our kind of JAMA Pediatrics one, estimating parental deaths from COVID-19. And it's by Hillis and others. This manuscript estimated for the US the likelihood of losing a father, a mother, or both. In their estimates for COVID-19 loss of a parent, they found about 50,000 individuals had lost any parent, but of that 50,000 in the US, only 9, according to their estimates, had lost both parents. So comparatively quite low rates, which are consistent with what we saw.
Okay, great. The next question, was a hierarchy of proximity in the dual estimated anywhere, perhaps given by a scale of depression and the type of family member who dies? This is in context of looking at the arithmetic sum of the relatives.
Was a hierarchy of, I didn't hear what you said.
Hierarchy of proximity.
Oh, like who you lose doesn't matter more. We did not attempt to consider that in our modeling data. There are ways that you could do it. You could, for instance, multiply by like genetic relatedness or something like that. But that wasn't something that I thought that I just didn't want to do it really. I feel like the idea of ranking the loss of a sibling compared to the loss of a parent is, I just am not super comfortable with like ranking which one matters more. In our European survey data analysis, the numbers of deaths of the 50,000 individuals, about 1,300 reported bereavement event. So it's not really large enough to kind of slice and dice in a million ways to find out which ones are more or less associated with depression. But in those data, we do find stronger associations of depression with loss of a family member than a non-family member, loss of a what we would think of as a primary family member, a parent, sibling, or child, compared to a kind of more extended family member. But those differences are not statistically significant. It's the type of thing where it's like an odds ratio of 1.71 for loss of a family versus 1.5 for loss of a non-family member. But the difference is not significant. I think it's consistent with the idea that it's probably worse, but it's not conclusive evidence in that regard. Can't reject the null that it's not different.
Thank you. The next question is in regards to like demographic surveys. Do you think it's possible to distinguish depression and sadness in both conceptualizations of emotions by social psychologists of emotions and also the perspective of traditional Chinese medicine? Sadness, which is more related to loss and therefore bereavement, is distinct from depression, which is more day-to-day and stochastic.
Yes, this issue has actually come up directly in some of our reviews on that manuscript. The challenge is that the question asks, are you sad or depressed? And these are in a lot of US-based psychological research considered separate constructs. But in the Euro-D depression scale, which is where the item directly comes from, they're asked at the same time. They're asked, are you sad or depressed? Which has been psychometrically evaluated a number of times for European older adults and found to have better kind of cross-national properties than, for instance, the geriatric depression scale, which is typically fielded in the US. We tried a number of ways to estimate, how good is this measure, how valid and reliable it is. And we found a lot of kind of things that suggest that the single item does correlate quite strongly with the full Euro-D depression scale, for instance, in all the waves of share that both have been fielded. that the single item is strongly predictive of the next next wave Euro-D depression scale in all the ways that it's been fielded, and that it's highly has high levels of convergent validity and retest reliability and other things like that, as well as similar relationships with other variables. I think that it's a limitation that they're asked in the same way, but that's how it's been done for about 20 years in this particular survey.
Okay, great. Sorry, okay, here, we'll do this one. How do we think about magnitude of the absolute numbers? 5 million bereaved sounds big, but 5 million bereaved out of 330 million not bereaved sounds very small. How do you think about this?
Right. I do always struggle with these kind of challenges where, sometimes I come up with an estimate of like, oh, it's 10%. I'm like, well, that's not a lot. Oh, that's a ton. And it's a challenge for me to really kind of contextualize that. I think that when you think of this in terms of the kind of levels of bereavement that are elevated compared to what is typically experienced. We had a prior estimate, which we haven't published, but of kind of normal deaths in the US bereavement without COVID. And our multiplier for that is about 8.6, I think. And with the same kin types. And there are about 3 million deaths in the US, so 3 million times 8 is, I'd have to do the math. I'm not very good at it off the top of my head, 24 million. So this is, about a 25% increase in the levels of bereavement that typically occur in a given year. And that is, I believe, a rather substantial increase over kind of typical bereavement levels. Second, 5 million people is the size of a large city. There's other ways you can sort of think about it. It's larger than several states. So in those senses, I do think it is quite a large number of people who lose a very close family member. And then when you start going out to friend losses and to aunt, uncle losses and cousin losses and all those types of ties, you quickly get a much larger number than the kind of close ties that we focused on. So I do think this is a very substantial increase comparatively. But one thing that we are working on is to try and understand this in comparison to prior mortality crises like World War II, like the 1918 flu, and things like that, which have very different profiles of kind of the death, ages of death. So I believe the comparisons could be rather instructive. And then building on sort of the work by Diego Gutierrez to understand population memory associated with these events. That's something we're looking at into the future too, of like under what, how long will it take till individuals who experience this bereavement kind of age out of the population in comparison to other kind of acute mortality crises in the past.
There's sort of a large conversation, so people should jump in if I might miss things here, but the original question was that the standard story about the 1918 flu was that it was soon forgotten. Is this story true? And if so, any thoughts on relevance to COVID? And there's some back and forth about there was maybe a lack of news and social media obviously wasn't as prevalent, but then maybe like sort of a more normalized perception of death at that time. And then I can ask you one other question that is related. In thinking about the effects of mass bereavement, have you and your team thought at all about effects of bereavement family loss that are not related to COVID-19, and whether non-COVID-19 bereavement might be differently associated with depression than COVID-19 bereavement due to the fact that those losses might not be linked in cause experience to the broader societal shock and trauma of the pandemic?
So I guess I have three responses. First, I'll respond to the 1918 World War I stuff. I'll talk. First, with the 1918 World War I stuff. I do think that this is a particular crisis that is very different than those, because those were younger adults, by and large, both of them. And COVID-19 is by and large older adults. The empirical evidence from prior studies is the clearest that the health ramifications of bereavement are very severe for older adults. This is largely because we haven't looked at it for younger adults, I think. But the health ramifications of losing a spouse for older adults, there's very strong causal evidence that suggests highly elevated mortality risks, like Felix Elwert's work and Nicholas Kritakis' work on this. And so I do think that that suggests that the implications of this are going to be a lasting trauma. There's great work by Ben Domingue at Stanford University suggesting that older adults who experience bereavement and then subsequently report depression associated with that using HRS data go on to have very elevated rates of experiencing physical health declines and then subsequent mortality. And so there's very strong evidence linking bereavement in older adulthood to health implications. And I think that that is going to manifest here, this substantial increase. The second question that you asked regarding comparison to other types of mortality, that's something that we hope to do in the future. And we're, I give it away, but we're hoping to use some of that share data to better understand that. I think that that will really enable us to understand that in a strong way. But right now, the kind of data are not available to look at that. There are, however, a number of studies that have been conducted on bereavement associations with health, physical and mental, for people using HRS data, using kind of clinic-based surveys and things like that. And those are relatively, there is very strong evidence that bereavement in general is highly associated with kind of negative life outcomes, both for older adults as well as for younger adults.
Great. Another question, can we use these estimates to know if our public health system is ready to respond to another mental health emergency? Should we target groups?
I believe that this could be informative in those regards. First, one thing that COVID has kind of laid bare to me is the real inadequacies in kind of the US data collection system. I've been really kind of shocked and amazed at the fact that we didn't have a national seroprevalence survey early on, which would have been very informative and helped with decision-making, for instance. So I do think that, our results contribute a very minor component of this, but the fact that you can't go look this up is a challenge. One thing that has kind of continued to befuddle me is that there isn't a source where you can look up the number of children who lost the incidence of children who lost a parent in the last year. All the estimates that we were able to find come from indirect sources like the children claiming Social Security benefits, or it's hard when I saw the chat, sorry, the children claiming Social Security benefits, or kind of prevalence estimates that you then convert into incidence rates through kind of the duration conversion. And I think that that's a real limitation. I was surprised that, it's not well known how many children lose a parent in the US each year. So that's one kind of component. In terms of prioritization, I do think that for older adults, our results suggest that there should be particular emphasis on understanding those who lose a spouse and a sibling, given the strong public health evidence suggesting that those are linked to elevated mortality risks. I think for younger adults and for children, there's relatively strong evidence that these things heighten their likelihood of, like a derailed educational trajectory in a counterfactual sense, that individuals who lose a parent and to some extent other other family members during kind of younger adulthood and in college and high school are at elevated risk of not attending college, dropping out of high school, not going to law school, and their kind of plans like that. So there might be some emphasis on kind of improving those aspects, and all of those things translate pretty directly through the education mechanism into long-term kind of health ramifications.
Thank you so much, Ashton. This is Josh.
Hey, Josh.
Let's. We're at 10:45 here, and before we thank you, let me just talk a little bit what we're going to do next. So we're kind of learning as we go, but our hope here was that you'd be able to stay for about another 10 or 15 more minutes and chat with people who are especially interested in kind of picking your brain more. So we'll kind of have an ongoing chat discussion here that's not part of our regular session, and I assume the most people are going to go take a break and kind of recharge for the rest of our long day. So originally we thought maybe we'd do this in breakout room and stuff, but we're just going to leave it in the same session here, if that's okay. Ashton, is that fine?
Totally fine.
Okay, great. So let's thank Ashton for a wonderful presentation, also amazingly rich discussion. And I thank everybody for their questions, and special thanks to Pyle for leading us all this last hour. So if you can turn off your mute and even show your faces if you want, so we can show Ashton our full appreciation.
Thank you very much for having me.
Super interesting, super interesting. So I'm actually going to go, but anybody who wants to stay, and Pyle, maybe you can stay also just to kind of guide any awkward moments.
Yeah.
Josh, I'll answer your question really briefly. I think it's largely just that people haven't looked at bereavement among younger adults in terms of health ramifications. I believe that it's very likely that losing a spouse is strongly associated with poor health among, say, people in their 30s, for instance, and losing a child and that sorts of thing. But it's not been looked at as extensively as it has. Among
and I don't disagree with you. I just it was a surprise. It was a surprise to me, and I think part of it is like what we can measure and what we can't measure. So maybe we can measure mortality. We can easier than we can send like lifelong hole in your heart type of feeling, which is also enormously traumatic. But it's also, I think, it's really useful to think about who's more vulnerable and who's more robust. And it could be that young relatives of a young person are relatively robust and can rebuild their lives, whereas older people may not be able to. So super interesting.
Thanks.
Hey, Ashton, it's Leora.
Hi, Leora.
I was just actually looking at some research on when parents lose a child. And there is research on what happens. Definitely greater risk for depression and all kinds of health outcomes later on. And I was looking at more younger parents. Some research I found was sort of middle-aged parents. And I'm kind of wondering, in terms of much older parents, that they might have sort of a split of some people for whom it's just simply devastating, and others for whom it's more philosophical. And it's like, whatever it is that they have in their lives, they kind of get these things happen. But so anyhow, I just wanted to sort of throw that in as a thought, but I did see some literature about that.
Yes, so there is, I don't mean to say that there's not research on it, but it hasn't been subjected to the same kind of causal inference approaches. The older adult kind of stuff has been, where they're really trying to understand through kind of, special comparisons, instrumental variable models, that sort of stuff, the likelihood of it. But no, one of my co-authors has published on this quite extensively, the loss of a child and health implications of that, and mental health implications of that. Emily Smith Greenaway has a great paper in Demography about it's based in sub-Saharan Africa, but the very high elevated risks of intimate partner violence following from loss of a child. There's also substantial research that suggests that loss of a child it's not an extremely common event, but it has one of the strongest associations with subsequent divorce among individuals, labor force, leaving the labor force, that sorts of thing. So I didn't mean to say that there's not as much on it. There is actually less on it than there is among spousal loss among older adults in terms of health. But the other thing is that it's with COVID-19, not as many people lose a child.
Yeah.
I wanted
and
to.
it's also on average, it's not, but you have subpopulations where they lose children much more often.
Yes, older adults, the 80 plus crowd, losing children that was relatively a common estimate in our models.
Okay, thank you.
I was delighted to see that SocSim is still being used. It's almost 50 years now since it was first launched. And I wonder, now that you've done this extensive kinship modeling with SocSim, where do you see augmentation or improvement to these simulation programs that could be made that would strengthen the work that you're doing?
Well, so I have so many ideas on this. Number one, easiest one to make is the current SocSim implementation caps the mortality rates that you can put in at age 100. So people can't survive past age 100, which is in the current mortality environment a challenge to understand things like, you know, what's going on in Japan, where very rapid increase in centenarian presence. So that's one thing that would be
It's an easy adjustment probably to build in.
relatively simple fix.
But
I
50
think
years
you could-
ago, it's not a question that would have arisen.
So that's one. I think that, I mean, I can get into the nitty gritty on this, but one of the things is trying to better understand how to model group transitions. So SocSim allows you to segment the population into groups. And one thing that is kind of a fascinating thing to be able to look at would be if you were to say segment the population into 50 states in the US, and then look at migration between age-graded migration between those states. Technically, I think this is actually feasible and possible with the current implementation, but the utility or ease of doing it is not readily available. Another one that would greatly increase the user base, I think, is making a Windows implementation, but I believe there are some efforts in those regards going on. Those are the ones that come most readily to mind. But I think that I mean, it's a fascinating program. I tried to, when I was in grad school, before I knew about SocSim, you know, I was cocky and arrogant, and I was like, well, I'll just write my own demographic simulation program, and spent a long time on it, and produces results relatively comparable to SocSim, but incredibly much slower. And so the implementation is really fascinating in terms of the speed of computation and the capacity to kind of analyze things, as well as some of the unique solvers that allow you to specify birth intervals and that sort of stuff that I had never thought of.